I never thought I would be the type to fall victim to a sick joke, but there I was, standing in my dimly lit living room on a chilly Wednesday night, heart racing as I faced the shocking surprise my boyfriend had planned for me. Jake had always been unpredictable, he liked to keep me on my toes, but this time it felt different, wrong even. Earlier that day, he had mentioned he was working on something special for our anniversary, and my mind raced with possibilities, maybe a romantic dinner, perhaps a weekend getaway, but instead, I found myself engulfed in an unsettling atmosphere as I entered the room filled with flickering shadows. My eyes widened in horror when I saw it, a life-size doll, disturbingly realistic, with my exact features, dressed in one of my favorite outfits and positioned awkwardly on the couch, her glassy eyes staring directly at me, a creepy smile painted across her face. It wasn't just the doll, it was the way it felt like a grotesque reflection of me. It took a moment for the confusion to wash over me, and when I finally turned to Jake, his eyes were lit up with an unsettling glee that sent chills down my spine. "Surprise!" he exclaimed, clapping his hands together, but there was a darkness behind his excitement that made my stomach churn. I thought it would be funny. Look how real it is. I could feel the blood drain from my face as I realized he wasn't joking. This absurd act of creating an uncanny doppelganger was somehow a gift in his mind, and I just stood there, paralyzed between disbelief and the creeping dread that the night was far from over. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to run away from whatever twisted game he was playing, but I hesitated, unsure if my reaction was warranted or if, somehow, I was the one overreacting. The jovial expression on his face quickly morphed into a frown as I backed away, making it clear I was horrified rather than amused. "Aren't you excited?" he pressed, stepping closer, the doll still looming behind him like some malevolent apparition. I went through a lot of trouble for this. A surge of adrenaline kicked in as I felt suffocated by the situation, drowning in an absurd reality I didn't choose, and just as I opened my mouth to voice my discomfort, I caught a glimpse of the doll again. A stray hair, light as a feather, shifted in a way that reminded me of how my own hair fell when I shook it out, a nauseating twinge that had my heart thudding painfully in my chest. Ignoring Jake's questions, I turned and stormed out, determined to escape the house, the doll, and the madness that threatened to envelop me. "Where are you going?" he yelled, but I didn't stop. I flew down the hall, out the front door, and onto the quiet street. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay there, not with the mad puppeteer who thought this was all just a joke. I walked for what felt like hours, my mind racing and my chest tight with a strange mix of fear and betrayal. I kept replaying the incidents, how often Jake had joked about how much I looked like my mother, the way he insisted that I had the same laugh as her, but never in a million years could I have guessed he'd take that obsession so far. I couldn't shake the chilling notion that he saw me as some kind of muse, creating a grotesque portrait instead of cherishing the real thing. As I approached a nearby park, I found my breath settling and decided to sit on a bench, my phone vibrating incessantly in my pocket, but I couldn't bring myself to look. I was afraid that somehow breaking that silence would lead him to me. But he didn't stop, he kept sending messages, each one more frantic than the last. "Where are you? And please come back," but no matter how many times I read them, I couldn't find the will to reply. The weight of my own reflection, both in the doll and in his eyes, suffocated me, and it was only when I felt the cool breeze and heard the birds chirping that I started to breathe more easily. Yet the relief was short-lived. A sudden rustling in the bushes broke my reverie, and my heart dropped to my stomach. I wasn't alone. Sitting there in the dark, I squinted, straining to see who, or what, was emerging. It could have been a raccoon or even a stray dog, but the way the shadows clustered unnervingly as they slipped into the streetlight exposed something much more sinister lurking in the depths of the night. I froze as I realized it was another doll, this one less refined, more worn, but unmistakably another twisted mimicry. My mind raced back to Jake and the flicker of life his creation almost felt. Had it been just a lifeless piece of plastic, or was it something else? Panic clawed at my throat. When I finally tore my gaze away from the horrifying sight, I found myself racing back toward my apartment, fueled by a desperation to confront the remnants of my own terror. Bursting through the door, I found Jake sitting on the couch, his smile replaced by a tense energy. "There you are. I was so worried." He approached me, arms extended as if to embrace, but I recoiled, the darkness and sweetness of that doll's smile now a cruel reminder of his warped affection. "Where is it?" I demanded, my voice shaking, unable to mask the terror brewing just beneath the surface. "Where's the other doll?" Confusion flashed across his face as he insisted that he didn't know what I was talking about, but deep down, I sensed something darker lurking beneath the facade of innocence. The air grew heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't shake, and just when I thought I might crumble under the weight of it all, a low chuckle escaped his lips, a sound that resonated with something deep within me. "You really should relax, babe," he said, his demeanor shifting eerily. "They're just dolls, they won't hurt you." Something snapped inside me, a red-hot fury igniting as the reality that he was playing a game with my psyche settled in. "These aren't just dolls to me, Jake. They're a representation of your sick obsession." I pushed past him, searching the dim corners of the room, wanting to scrub away every reminder of what he had gifted me. I could feel his presence hovering behind me, a shadow that twisted my fear into rage, and when I saw it again, the doll he had made for me, it felt like a mirror reflecting my own horror. "You're sick," I shouted, gripping the doll's cold hand, fingers trembling. I thought of that other doll, lurking in the park, and suddenly it all clicked. It wasn't just a sick surprise, it was a warning. I realized in that very moment that I couldn't let him control my reactions any longer. With newfound determination, I turned to Jake with a fire I didn't know I had. "I can't do this anymore." In his eyes, I saw a flicker of something terrifying, a darkness that promised far worse than the petty horror of plastic. He stepped toward me, feigning innocence, but the tension in the room told me I had crossed an unseen line. "You don't mean that," he said, his voice low and predatory, and my heart raced, the fear settling back in. "I made you special, just like you wanted, and you're going to regret this." My feet guided me to the door, and before I could think, I flung it open and left the mockery of my own humanity behind, knowing I might never feel safe again. I ran into the night, feeling a primal instinct to survive, determined to escape the darkness that lurked behind every shadow, but as I sprinted away, a chilling thought gripped me. What if the night was just beginning, and this was one surprise that wouldn't let me go?
When I was a kid, I had a passionate obsession really, with model trains. I would spend hours constructing intricate layouts, careful to create realistic landscapes and bustling towns filled with tiny figures and miniature trees. My parents would encourage me, gifting me new tracks or cars every birthday, but as the years rolled on, life got in the way. School, jobs, responsibilities, they all crept in and gradually smothered that childhood passion until the little boxes of train sets were consigned to the dusty attic, forgotten amidst piles of old clothes and sentimental relics. It wasn't until my 30th birthday that I stumbled upon an old box while cleaning out my family home after my mother's passing. The faint smell of pine and dust wafted out as I pried the lid open to reveal a trove of memories, my old train set, painted as well as I could manage as a child, a few dusty locomotives, and even a half-finished layout I'd crafted in my bedroom all those years ago. As I sat there, nostalgia washed over me like a warm blanket. I could almost hear the soft chug of the train moving along the tracks and feel the thrill of watching it navigate the sharp corners I had so painstakingly constructed. I picked up the tiny pieces, grazing my fingers over them, a mix of happiness and sorrow rushing through me. It felt sacrilege to just throw it all away, so I decided to take the box back to my apartment, hoping it would nourish my soul during this trying time. Setting it up in my living room, I couldn't help but start to reconstruct my childhood layout. Even with a few decades under my belt, it all came back to me, the perfect gradient for the hills, the careful placement of trees, and even the small-town figures dressed in old-timey clothing, frozen in time. As I rolled up my sleeves and worked late into the night, I found my mind wandering. I envisioned my old town from memory, how I had named every inch of land and how important it all felt. The hours slipped away, and dew twinkled on the windowsill as dawn began sneaking into the room. I was elated. This wasn't just about trains, it was about connecting with a lost piece of myself, the kid who dreamed of building great cities and expansive railways. As the sun rose, I made a cup of coffee and turned on the small train engine I had salvaged. It sputtered at first, but then it took off, chugging smoothly along the newly laid tracks. The clickety-clack rhythm reverberated off the walls, taking me back years, triggering a cascade of memories. I had completely lost track of time, but just as I was lost in the nostalgia, I noticed something odd. One of the figures, a little man I'd named Harold, had shifted positions. I brushed it off, maybe I was just tired. Yet, I found it strange. So, I set him back into the correct spot, only to see he had moved again. A chill crept down my spine, and I soon convinced myself I was simply overimaginative. It was just a toy, after all, no real magic existed. The next night, I returned to the train, determined to finish my layout. I adjusted Harold and placed him beside a little shop I had built. Once again, the train was running smoothly when things took a turn. I'd just poured myself a cup of coffee when I heard a soft voice emanating from the layout. "Do you like the town?" I froze, the hairs on my neck standing up. I thought I was losing it, maybe I hadn't slept enough. I dismissed it and continued. Yet as the train went around the bend, the voice returned, clearer this time, almost childlike. "I want to play." This time I turned to see Harold had not only moved again but was now just beyond the edge of the town square, looking up at me. I was paralyzed with fear, my heart racing for no clear reason, my mind battling with rationality. I blinked. Harold was still there, unmoving, with a small toy bucket in his hands, a toy shovel resting beside him. I backed away slowly backing my way off the scene, willing myself not to scream. All of a sudden, the train took a sharp turn, derailing and crashing dramatically off the tracks, startling me. I felt something wash over me, an echo of fear and exhilaration as old childhood memories swarmed my thoughts, and I rationalized that it was just my imagination playing tricks with me. Yet, as I finally went to bed that night, I heard the voice again, faintly sounding through the walls of my room. "Why don't you come play?" It was no longer just a thought, this wasn't just a memory, I had stumbled onto something unexplainable. Days turned into weeks, and I fought with my sanity. I thought about calling a therapist, telling them about my issues with the train set, but each time my hand hovered over the phone, I felt a strange pull preventing me from picking up. I didn't want to face the truth that maybe I was losing my grip on reality. Slowly, I accepted Harold's presence. It became routine. Every night, I would set him out, and I found myself talking back, sometimes even asking him about the little town, the people within it. He never answered, but I could sense his small, iron figure watching me, waiting for something. One night, after finishing my latest round of fantasies and with a weight in my stomach, I finally dared to ask what we both were thinking. "What do you want?" The little figure seemed to lean towards me, whooshing like a breeze, and suddenly everything went black. In that pitch darkness, I felt a curious tug, as if being pulled from my chair, and within seconds, colors surrounded me, the town came into focus, colorful houses lining the streets, and the little figures all around me. And just beyond the tracks, Harold stood, waving me forward. "Come on, you belong here," he said, his voice more vibrant than ever, resonating in my bones. I gasped, taken aback, was I really out of my body? With no other thoughts available, I took a step forward onto the glowing terrain, and reality shifted. The town erupted with color, life blooming around me, every detail more vivid than I could have imagined. The houses were alive with stories, and the people, my tiny companions, watched me with curious eyes. I was utterly captivated, energy radiating through me as I jumped into the world I had crafted long ago. Harold met me again, this time with loud cheers from townsfolk applauding my return. It felt like a dream I never wanted to end. Days passed, it could have been a lifetime, and I found myself relishing the feeling of belonging, lost in creative bliss. But soon, shadows crept around the edges of this dreamlike world, whispering doubts and fears that had to be confronted. I realized that the longer I stayed away from the real world, the harder it would be to return. I felt the town pulling me back, a tug of war with my old life still waiting outside the cozy existence I had built. I fought hard against letting go, but memories reminded me of those I had left behind, my mother, who had encouraged me, my friends, and the responsibilities I had neglected. I closed my eyes, fighting against the allure of eternal peace. "I have to go back," I finally said, my voice shaking as I faced Harold while shouts of shock rippled through the crowd. A small, gleaming tear formed in Harold's eye, he simply nodded. "When you're ready, we'll be waiting." In a violent spin, the walls of my town collapsed, and I found myself flung back to my apartment, gasping for breath as reality engulfed me once again. I was still pacing around a small coffee table, tracts scattered everywhere, and the sun shining through the curtains, as if nothing had happened. But it did. It felt too real for me to ignore. I stood there drenched in sweat, a whirlwind of emotions raging within. I finally understood that my passion didn't die, it had merely been forgotten, waiting patiently for me to rediscover it once more. From that day on, I visited my creations every evening, but now I treated them like portals, understanding the bond I shared with Harold wasn't a burden, but a companion guiding me into the depths of my own imagination. And as months went on, I built my life outside the realm too, reconnecting with friends, working through grief, and gradually finding joy where I thought I had lost it long ago. Harold would always be there, a reminder of the power of creativity. He taught me that every passion has the potential to ignite a fire in our hearts, even when it feels buried under the weight of reality. So I ask you, what forgotten pieces of yourself are waiting to be rescued in the dusty corners of your attic? The day I rediscovered my forgotten passion became not just a journey back, it was a thrilling reminder that sometimes, the very things we set aside can lead us on the most transformative adventures, and all we have to do is take the first step. The time I made a mistake and learned from it starts with me reflecting on a regret, one I've carried for years, but I've never shared it because it sounds insane, like something out of a horror film. But I feel compelled to get it off my chest now, especially since Halloween is around the corner, and I know I can't keep it bottled up any longer. It all started about 5 years ago when I was an anxious sophomore in college, dealing with the usual pressures of exams, relationships, and a desperate need to fit in. I wasn't exactly popular, but there was this one social event that seemed promising, a mysterious gathering in the woods that people whispered about. Imagine a bonfire in a secluded part of the forest, candles in paper bags outlining pathways, and flickering lights reflected off the leaves. It was supposed to be a night of revelations and connections, but deep down, I was terrified of what might actually happen, should I take that leap and step into the unknown. Nonetheless, curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself following a group of friends to the woods that fateful Friday night. The air was electric, charged with the thrill of untold secrets and laughter echoing around us. As we arrived, I was hit by the smell of smoke and the warmth of the crackling fire. People were engaged in deep conversations, and an unspoken bond pulsed through the night. I was told by my friend Sarah to look out for something called the offering. Apparently, it was some bizarre tradition where attendees would write their biggest fears on pieces of paper and toss them into a fire to, supposedly, cleanse themselves. Entering into the circle, I hesitated, mind racing with my own fears. I had issues, battles with anxiety, overwhelming pressure to succeed, and failing friendships. But I pushed the voice of doubt out of my head and found a scrap of paper in my pocket, scribbling my deepest fear with shaky hands. I tossed the paper into the fire as instructed, watching it curl and ignite, feeling an odd sense of relief wash over me, as if maybe releasing it would set me free. It felt comforting yet oddly unsettling. The night continued, spirits were high, and I met some cool people. A guy named Jake had a whole aura around him, charismatic and a bit mysterious, easily the kind of person who'd be the protagonist in one of those teen dramas. We chatted, laughed, and felt this undeniable chemistry. We even danced, albeit awkwardly, under the moonlight, and everything felt perfect for a moment. Things took a turn, though, when I stumbled upon a makeshift altar at the edge of the bonfire area. Candles flickered ominously amidst strange symbols sprawled across a piece of worn-down wood. In admission, my curiosity got the better of me again, and I approached it, noticing a tiny box nestled between 2 candles. Unmarked and old, it almost felt like it was calling out to me. In my impulsive nature, I reached for it, ignoring the whispered warnings of my friends. Laughter faded into the background as I opened the box and found a small mirror inside. The moment I looked at my reflection, everything around me shifted, the fire flickered out, shadows danced, and suddenly I wasn't just seeing my own reflection. I swear something stared back at me, an echo of darker me, someone with a twisted smirk, eyes glimmering with malice. Shock and fear took hold of me as I stumbled back, and in my panic, I knocked over one of the candles. It fell, and the flames licked dangerously close to the makeshift altar. People screamed and rushed to grab buckets of water to douse the flames while I held up the mirror, paralyzed by both fear and confusion. From that point on, everything spiraled. I could feel heat rising, and foreboding thoughts chased me like ghosts. It was as if something I had unleashed stirred beneath the surface. I hesitated too long, and when I finally let go of the mirror and tossed it aside, dark tendrils emerged from the shadows surrounding me. It's hard to describe, they twisted in unnatural ways, snatching poor Sarah, who had come to check on me. I could hear her scream, and it echoed in my head long after. The flames roared back to life as chaos ensued, and everyone rushed to escape the remnants of something unholy we had awakened. I stumbled back toward the bonfire, caught between horror and regret. The night ended with our group scattered, and I finally recalled one of those elder warnings about the woods, rumors of spirits, of those who had come too close and stayed too long. They became part of the forest, forever lost. I knew I had made a grave mistake. In the aftermath, I couldn't shake the feeling of accountability. My reckless curiosity led to something darker. The guilt consumed me, like a parasite burrowing deeper with each passing day. I never spoke to my friends again, convinced they'd blame me for what happened. The whispers and stares from classmates made it worse. I became a ghost in the halls of my own college, burdened with fear and a heavy conscience. To this day, I struggle to forgive myself. Months felt like years, and then one night, I decided to face my fears. I returned to the forest, the place where it all began, alone. It was eerie, that same unmistakable energy thrumming through the air. But at the heart of it, maybe I hoped to find some semblance of closure. I brought a new paper and a pen, and I found my way back to that spot. The bonfire was long gone, but the circle was faintly etched into the ground, as if the past was still lingering there. I shot my fears out into the darkness once more, knowing full well that this time, they wouldn't consume me. I learned that mistake makes us human, but the aftermath can either strengthen us or break us. And as I stood there, I felt a flicker of hope. As crazy as it sounds, I think I even heard a faint whisper of forgiveness trailing off with the wind. So if you find yourself at a gathering that tempts the unknown, remember this: curiosity can unlock doors better left shut. You can learn from your mistakes, but some shadows might haunt you forever. Whatever choices you make, carry your fears with openness, for they are but a reflection. You'll find strength if you dare face what lies beneath. Please, don't make the mistakes I did. Let my tale serve as a warning, a reminder to tread carefully in realms where darkness lurks and curiosity can ignite something you may never recover from.
I never thought that renting a storage unit would change my life, but it did, at least, not like this. Last year, after my life fell apart, divorce, job loss, and a sense of aimlessness, I decided to shove what little belongings I had left into a small, nondescript storage facility just off the beaten path, a place that mirrored my disarray with its peeling paint and flickering lights. I was in the middle of a breakdown when I first saw Unit 237, sandwiched between a couple of empty others that seemed almost too eager to be abandoned. The door looked older than the facility itself, a reddish-brown that had started to fade into a lifeless gray, but the lock on it was shiny and new, an odd contrast that sparked something in my curiosity. It was just a storage unit, right? By all accounts, it should have been empty or filled with discarded junk, but as I stood there with my rental agreement in hand, I felt an inexplicable pull toward this unit as if it was whispering secrets only I could hear. My curiosity got the better of me, and despite the owner's assurances that everything was fine, I couldn't shake the feeling that something lurked behind that door, waiting. So, I paid my first month and left, trying to ignore the odd sense of dread that gnawed at me like a feral cat in the night. Days passed, the dark intrigue of Unit 237 wove into the fabric of my thoughts until it became impossible to ignore. Finally, after a particularly sleepless night filled with anxiety and ghostly visions of what might lie inside, I decided to go back to the storage facility, the fluorescent lights buzzing eerily as I approached. I don't know what I was expecting, perhaps an old couch, forgotten toys, or maybe mere dust. Instead, I was met with a sense of foreboding so dense it almost felt like a weight pressing against my chest. I fumbled with the key, heart hammering in my ears as I turned it in the lock. The door creaked open ever so slowly, and I half expected a musty smell to greet me, but instead, there was a chill that wrapped around me, stealing the warmth from my skin. Peering inside, I was greeted by an unassuming dimness. It was packed full of stacked cardboard boxes, all of them bound in frayed rope, yet the air felt electric, and I could hear, was that breathing? I forced myself to step inside, the sound of the door slamming shut behind me echoing like a gunshot. As I rifled through the boxes, I noticed they were labeled with years, 97, 02, 08, all the way to present day, but the oddity was that none of the contents were visible beyond the coarse fibers that brushed against my fingertips. Faint whispers crept into my consciousness as I leaned closer to one of the boxes. They were roughly half open, as if someone had begun to unpack but had changed their mind. That's when my fingers brushed against something cold, and I yanked my hand back. I was afraid it was just ice, but the sound had seemed so alive, so ready to tell me a story. My heart raced as I shifted boxes around, feeling the intensity of the oppressive atmosphere weighing heavier on my shoulders. Then I found it, a padlocked case, all steel and stormy gray, glinting like a predator in the shadows. I was compelled to touch it, but dread danced around me as soon as I laid my palm flat against the cool metal. How do you unlock something that's never had a key? The whispers grew louder, desperate, almost a cacophony of longing that settled deep in my bones, and I couldn't tell if I was losing my sanity or if the unit itself was alive and wanted something from me. It felt wrong to leave. I think I knew that whatever lay in that padlock was something that had been waiting for someone to find it. I left that day without unearthing its secrets, but I couldn't escape the weight of it on my mind. I went back the next day, and the day after that, each time feeling a compulsion to pry it open, to unlock whatever shadowy tale waited within. The minutes turned to hours, consumed by thoughts of that case, the whispers beckoning me onward, as if time itself distorted inside that unit. One fateful night, I broke. I wanted to see it, to feel it, so I returned armed with tools I had no idea how to use. Under the flickering lights, bathed in shadows that dipped around me like a dancer, I sat in front of that locked box, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I attempted to pick the lock. It was then that a wave of ice washed over me, and the digits of the lock suddenly clicked open, as though it had offered me entrance. I opened it, heart racing, only to reveal a stack of aged photographs, brittle and curling like the edges of storm clouds. Atop them lay an old newspaper clipping, its headline blaring about a couple who had gone missing 20 years ago right in that very town, each picture showcasing a family, smiling, vibrant, but behind each joyful face loomed an uncanny unknowing, a grasping void that sent chills down my spine. As I flipped through the photographs, the whispers crescendoed, and in some of the images, dark shapes began to reveal themselves, creeping out from the shadows behind the people like ghastly reminders of their fate. They beckoned from beyond the paper, almost like they wanted to break free and drench the real world in the grime they carried. I stumbled back, grasping the edge of the case to prevent myself from falling, when suddenly, like an awakening, the lights flickered violently, and the door behind me slammed shut. I screamed, the air thick with the smell of decay and darkness wrapping tighter around me than before. Through the hiss of silence came laughter, malevolent and echoing, churning louder until it shook the very foundation of my sanity. I felt icy fingers trailing along my neck and saw the shadows within the photos stirring. They were whispering, calling to me with voices wrapped in sorrow and rage, and I knew. I knew I had to get out before they found a way into my world, before the chill and the dark became part of me. In a surge of adrenaline, I lunged for the door, yanking it hard, but it wouldn't budge. Panic flooded my veins as the shadows lunged forward from the photographs, their grotesque faces twisted yet strangely familiar, and with a dark realization, I saw them for what they truly were, reflections of those who had come before, trapped like forgotten echoes within the confines of their own histories. I screamed for help, but my cries were swallowed by the shadows closing in, and I was left with a chilling understanding that something had laid in wait for me all along, an insatiable hunger that worked through the years, seeking a conduit back into the world. I'm writing this now from my car, speed racing down the road, hands trembling as I rewind the memory over and over, afraid to sleep, afraid to breathe, haunted by the idea of what I left behind, and the certainty that one day, it will come for me again, dragging me back to Unit 237, because there's something locked inside it, something that wants to be freed, someone who wishes they had never lingered for too long, exploring the darkness that hid beyond the door. So please, if you find yourself near a storage unit, just turn back. Don't look inside, they need a vessel, and you don't want to be that vessel. Trust me.
It was a chilly evening in late October, the kind where the sun sets early and the streets take on a gloomy air. I was walking home from work, the leaves crunching under my feet, the last rays of light fading away when I noticed a small figure huddled in the shadows of an alleyway. As I approached, my heart sank. A scruffy little dog seemed to be trembling, its fur matted and dirty, a makeshift collar barely clinging to its neck. It looked up at me with wide, sad eyes that seemed to whisper a desperate plea for help. I felt a surge of compassion. This poor animal must have been abandoned, and the thought made my chest tighten. I glanced around to see if anyone else was around, but the street was empty, and instinct kicked in. I knelt down slowly so as not to frighten it and spoke softly, "Hey there, little one. Are you lost?" The dog didn't flinch or bark, it just stared at me, those soulful eyes a mixture of fear and hope. I reached into my bag for some treats I always carried, just in case I met another furry friend. Holding out my hand, I didn't want to startle it, but it didn't take long for the aroma of the treats to tantalize its nose. Cautiously, it took a small step forward, sniffing the air, as if weighing the danger versus the desire for something to eat. After what felt like an eternity, it took another step and finally gobbled up the treat from my palm. A sense of relief washed over me as I saw a flicker of trust emerge in its demeanor. For a few minutes, we shared an unspoken bond, a moment that felt profound in its simplicity. I rummaged through my bag for more treats and reached out again, signaling it to come closer and eat. It seemed to sense that I meant no harm and came a little closer, allowing me to see the severity of its condition. Its ribs were visible through its dirty fur, and it had a few cuts on its legs, clearly a survivor of rough circumstances. I knew I couldn't leave it there. I checked my phone and found a nearby animal shelter. They accepted stray animals and provided them with care. However, I couldn't just pick it up and carry it there. It wouldn't trust me yet. I needed a plan. So, I sat down on the ground beside it, keeping my movements slow and gentle, talking to it in soft tones. "You're safe now. I promise I'll take you somewhere warm and cozy." Hours seemed to pass, but eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the little dog decided I was no longer a threat. It ambled closer, sniffing my fingers before finally nudging against my leg, seeking comfort. My heart soared. It was time to act. I gingerly took off my jacket and wrapped it around the shivering bundle of fur, lifting it gently into my arms. The dog tensed at first but then relaxed when it sensed that I was warm and safe. It was a struggle to balance my phone in one hand while holding this fragile soul in the other, but adrenaline kicked in as I walked towards the shelter. The icy wind stung my face, but I was determined. We reached the shelter just before closing time. I burst through the doors, holding this little creature close to my chest, desperate for someone to help me save it. The receptionist took one look at us and jumped into action, her compassion palpable as she snatched a blanket and helped me lay the dog down gently onto the counter. After a flurry of activity, a vet tech came over, her face a mixture of concern and professionalism. "What happened?" she asked, her hands moving with purpose. I explained everything, my voice trembling as I detailed the state I'd found the dog in. The vet tech nodded, her eyes never leaving the shivering pup. "We'll take care of him, don't worry. You did a good thing bringing him in." I watched in awe as they began examining the little dog. I couldn't stand the thought of leaving, so I lingered on the sidelines, anxiously tapping my foot. In moments like those, time stands still, and it felt like hours passed before they finally stepped outside to talk to me. "He's going to be okay," the vet tech reassured me. "He's underweight and a bit dehydrated, but we can treat him. He'll need some TLC, and we'll start him on a solid meal plan." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I felt an overwhelming rush of relief. Thank you so much." As they prepared the necessary treatments, I found myself pacing outside the building, unable to shake the guilt of seeing so many strays like him living on the streets. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a soft yip behind me. I turned, and there was the little pup, poking its head out from behind the vet tech who was holding it. The tears I hadn't realized had been on my cheeks spilled over. It looked at me, its eyes brighter than before. "What are you going to name him?" the vet tech asked, smiling at the little flurry of energy before us. I didn't have to think long. "How about Charlie?" I said, and the name felt right. Charlie wagged his tail like it was the happiest moment of his life, and I knew that I had made the right decision. The shelter couldn't have been more welcoming. They offered to keep him until he was fully ready for adoption, but in my heart, I knew I wanted Charlie in my life for good. As the days turned into weeks, I visited Charlie every single day. Each time I walked through those doors, he greeted me with ecstatic barks and tail wags that warmed my heart. It was clear he was healing, both physically and emotionally. Eventually, I started the adoption process, and the day finally came when I could bring him home. I had prepared my apartment for his arrival, filled with toys, a cozy bed, and enough food to keep a small army fed. When I brought him home, it was like a dream come true. Charlie bounded through the door like he owned the place, sniffing every corner with exuberance. Our bond deepened with every passing day. He became my shadow, my confidant, and the most loyal friend I could have asked for. I often reflected on that cold October night, how a simple choice changed both of our lives forever. The stray that once shivered in the shadows had become my warm, happy companion, a testament to the unyielding spirit of love and resilience. I realized that helping a stray animal wasn't just an act of kindness, it was an opportunity to change lives, one wagging tail at a time. Now, every October, I take Charlie on a long walk to celebrate his rescue, spreading awareness about the importance of helping strays. And as I look down at him, wagging his tail with joy, I can't help but smile, knowing that the time I helped a stray animal became a heartwarming tale that I would cherish forever. The time I stood up to a bully, my unexpected victory. The time I stood up to a bully, my unexpected victory. I still remember the first day I met him, that towering figure with a look that could turn your blood cold and a voice like thunder, a kid everyone was scared of but no one dared to confront. We all knew his name, Aaron, whispered in hushed tones across hallways and behind closed doors. He'd made it his mission to remind everyone he was the strongest, the toughest, and he'd target anyone who dared to challenge that narrative, even if that challenge was unintentional. It wasn't long before I became his next target. I wasn't exactly the most popular kid, but I kept to myself, a strategy I thought would keep me out of harm's way. One day, in the middle of gym class, I happened to glance at Aaron's direction. He caught my eye, and I could see something change in his expression, like he'd found his next victim. From then on, it was almost daily, the shoves in the hallway, the snide comments muttered just loud enough for me to hear, the occasional accidental trip that sent me sprawling on the ground. I felt trapped, as though I was constantly looking over my shoulder, trying to anticipate where he'd come from next. I tried everything to avoid him, altering my routes, slipping out of class a few seconds early, even asking my teachers if I could sit closer to their desks, hoping that proximity to authority would protect me. But it didn't matter. Aaron always found a way, like he could smell my fear, and every time he pushed me around, I felt my self-worth crumble just a little bit more. The worst was that no one else seemed to notice, or maybe they just didn't care. My friends looked the other way, teachers chalked it up to boys being boys, and even my parents didn't really understand, advising me to ignore him and hoping he'd get bored. But Aaron wasn't the kind to get bored. I began dreading school, feigning sickness just to avoid facing another day of his torment. I'd lie awake at night, my mind spiraling with worry, every inch of my body tensed for the blows that would come tomorrow, wondering how long I could keep this up before something in me broke. But there was one thing that kept me going, a small glimmer of anger that simmered beneath the fear, a resentment that grew every time Aaron threw me against a locker or laughed in my face. I didn't know what to do with that anger, though. I felt powerless against someone so much bigger, so much stronger. Then one day, everything changed. It was a Wednesday afternoon, right after school, and I was walking home alone, taking my usual shortcut through the park, hoping to avoid Aaron and his entourage. But I should have known better. As I turned a corner, I saw him standing there, waiting, a smirk on his face that sent a chill down my spine. He walked up to me, blocking my path, taunting me, mocking me for being weak, calling me names that I'd heard 1,000 times but still cut deep. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the familiar surge of fear, but something in me snapped. I don't know where the courage came from, maybe it was the months of pent-up anger, the countless nights I'd spent dreading him, the exhaustion from constantly running. But I took a step forward, meeting his gaze head-on, and I told him to back off. My voice shook, but I didn't back down. His smirk faltered, just for a second, replaced by a look of surprise that quickly morphed into rage. He shoved me, hard, but I didn't fall. I stood my ground, even though my heart was pounding so loud I thought it might burst out of my chest. He tried again, but this time, something incredible happened. Someone saw. A woman walking her dog across the park had stopped, watching the confrontation unfold. She didn't know the whole story, didn't know who I was or who Aaron was, but she stepped forward, her voice calm but firm, telling him to leave me alone. And in that moment, I saw Aaron hesitate, saw him falter as the power he'd held over me slipped away. He mumbled something under his breath, gave me one last scowl, and then walked away, leaving me standing there, heart racing, hands trembling, but feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, pride. I'd done it. I'd stood up to him. I'd faced my fear, and even though it had taken the help of a stranger to drive him off, I realized that the power he'd held over me was gone. From that day on, Aaron never bothered me again. He'd look at me sometimes, a flicker of his old arrogance in his eyes, but he kept his distance. It was as if he knew that I wasn't the same person he'd bullied for months, that I'd found a strength inside me he couldn't break. And as the days turned into weeks, I started feeling lighter, like I'd shed a weight I didn't even realize I'd been carrying. I started to enjoy school again, started walking through the halls with my head held a little higher, no longer feeling the need to hide. It was an unexpected victory, one that didn't come with a triumphant moment or a grand gesture, but one that taught me more about myself than I could have ever imagined. I learned that standing up for myself didn't make me weak, didn't make me the target. It made me strong. And even though the fear hadn't completely vanished, even though I still had moments where I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder, the victory I claimed that day had given me something even more powerful than confidence. It had given me the knowledge that I could stand up to my fears, that I was stronger than I'd ever realized. Looking back, I don't know if Aaron even remembers that day, if he thinks about me at all. But for me, it was a turning point, a moment that changed everything, a reminder that sometimes, the smallest acts of courage can lead to the biggest victories. And in the end, that's all that matters. The moment I realized I was in the wrong, a lesson learned. The moment I realized I was in the wrong is one of those memories I'll never forget, a crystal clear image burned into my mind, and though it's painful, I think I needed to go through it to finally understand the kind of person I was becoming. It all started innocently enough, with me, a typical young professional who thought he had everything figured out, from his career to his relationships. I'd landed my dream job at a high-profile consulting firm right out of college, a role I'd worked insanely hard to get, pouring every ounce of my time and energy into the endless projects and presentations. My job, as exciting and intense as it was, quickly became the center of my life, to the point where I started seeing everything and everyone around me as mere background noise. Friends would invite me out, but I'd decline, using work as an excuse, or when I did show up, I'd be on my phone half the time, answering emails, giving off that busy and important vibe that I'd grown to believe defined me. My family, too, got the short end of the stick. I'd skip family gatherings, birthdays, holidays, all under the guise of having too much going on and big things in the pipeline. If I'm being honest, though, I wasn't just busy, I was disconnected, isolated even, slowly pushing everyone away while telling myself I was on the right track. At first, I didn't even notice the subtle toll this was taking on my relationships. I chalked it up to growing up, being ambitious, going after my dreams. But over time, I began to feel this emptiness creeping in, a hollow feeling I tried to ignore by throwing myself even harder into work, filling my life with numbers, presentations, and meetings. Then, one day, my best friend, Danny, called me, saying he was going through a rough patch and needed to talk. Danny and I went way back to college days, but recently, our connection had faded. When he called, I was right in the middle of preparing for a huge pitch, and I could barely hide my irritation when he asked if we could grab a drink. I didn't even let him finish before I shot him down, claiming I had too much on my plate. He paused on the line, sighed, and said he understood, even though I could hear the disappointment in his voice. Later that night, I found myself replaying that conversation, something nagging at me, a tiny voice whispering that I'd messed up, but I brushed it off, telling myself Danny would get over it. A few weeks later, my sister asked me to come home for a family dinner, something we hadn't done in ages. She even mentioned how much my parents missed me, especially Mom, who'd been asking about me nonstop. I promised I'd be there, but when the day came, I found myself stuck in the office, buried under another pile of deadlines. I didn't even call to let them know I wouldn't make it. I told myself they'd understand, that they knew how demanding my job was. But then, something happened that shattered the illusion I'd built around myself. I came into work one morning, just like any other day, to find out that a young colleague of mine had been let go, someone I'd mentored, actually, someone who looked up to me and had reminded me a lot of my younger self. I couldn't understand why they'd cut him loose. He was talented, smart, and dedicated, but apparently, the firm had been making efficiency improvements, a sterile way of saying they'd cut costs by letting people go. It hit me harder than I expected, but I buried that discomfort too, telling myself that's just the way things are in our field. That same night, as I was walking to my car, I saw Danny waiting outside the office building. He looked different, pale, tired, almost haunted. I was about to tell him I was busy, that we'd catch up another time, but he cut me off, saying we needed to talk now. Reluctantly, I agreed, and we went to a nearby coffee shop, where he sat down and finally opened up. Danny told me that his dad had been diagnosed with cancer a few months back, and he'd been struggling to cope, feeling like his whole world was crumbling. He said he tried to reach out, tried to talk to me, but every time he called, I'd been too busy, too wrapped up in my own world. He even reminded me of that phone call a few weeks back, the one I'd brushed off so easily, and as he spoke, I felt a sickening realization settle over me. I'd been so focused on myself, on my goals, on my career, that I'd failed to notice the people around me were struggling, hurting, needing me. It wasn't just Danny, either. I thought about all the missed calls from my mom, the invitations I'd ignored, the friends I'd pushed away, all because I was convinced my work was more important than anything else. Sitting there, listening to Danny pour his heart out, I felt like the worst kind of friend. I wanted to apologize, to make it right somehow, but I didn't even know where to start. That night, I went home and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep, haunted by the person I'd become. The next day, I called my mom and apologized, explaining everything, and for the first time in years, I heard her cry over the phone. I took a few days off work, drove home, and spent time with my family, reconnecting, mending the wounds I'd caused. It was awkward at first, like relearning how to be close to them, but slowly, it felt like coming back to life. I met up with Danny, too, and promised him that I'd be there, no matter what. And for the first time, I started setting boundaries at work, prioritizing the people who mattered instead of treating them like an afterthought. I learned a hard lesson from that experience, a lesson about what truly matters in life, and it wasn't the job, the title, or the money. It was the people, the relationships, the connections that make life meaningful. Looking back, I'm grateful for that rude awakening, as painful as it was, because without it, I might never have realized how wrong I was. I never believed in life coaches. For me, they were just glorified motivational speakers, people who preyed on your vulnerabilities and sold hollow promises wrapped in shiny self-help packages. I used to scoff at those who paid hundreds for advice about self-discovery, but that all changed one fateful evening in mid-January. It was one of those bleak, cold nights when the world feels heavy. I was stuck in a rut, drowning in a sea of regrets and uncertainties about my life choices. I had just come from a failed job interview, another blow to my dwindling self-esteem. Defeated, I took a walk to clear my head, but instead, I found myself wandering into a cafe I had never seen before. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and there were a few people scattered around, some tapping away on their laptops and others lost in conversation. An odd sign on the wall caught my eye, "Tonight's special, a free life coaching session." I chuckled to myself, contemplating the absurdity of it all. But I was curious, what could a stranger possibly tell me that I didn't already know? Yet, out of sheer boredom and desperation, I decided to stay. Soon enough, a woman named Clara entered, radiating an unsettling mix of energy and calm. She was dressed in vibrant colors, with an aura that suggested she had plucked it straight from a better world. Clara stood in front of us, exuding confidence, her easy smile breaking the ice. Without any introduction, she launched into her spiel about the power of perspective, of embracing the unknown, and stepping out of our comfort zones. I felt my skepticism creeping back in, but then she looked at me directly. "You, my friend, seem like you're carrying a heavy weight," she said, and I felt an involuntary shiver. Even in a room full of strangers, she made it seem like I was the only one who mattered. Clara began asking questions, probing my mind like a skilled surgeon. Without even realizing it, I was sharing parts of my life I had tucked away, my fear of failure, my past relationships that ended in heartache, my dreams that seemed to drift further away with each passing year. It felt surreal, therapeutic even. By the end of the session, I found myself captivated, a complete shift occurring in my perspective. She talked about the concept of the invisible wall we build around ourselves, how it blocks us from the opportunities life throws our way. It was as if she was staring deep into my soul, unveiling every hidden insecurity I had buried over the years. The session wrapped up with a challenge. Clara invited each of us to do one thing that terrified us, to share it online in a week, thereby holding ourselves accountable. I chuckled slightly at the thought of sharing my personal struggles on social media, but oddly, I found the idea liberating. I left the cafe feeling strangely high, illuminated by a flicker of hope. Over the next few days, I contemplated what I could do, not to just follow through but to genuinely push myself. A week later, standing in front of my computer, I finally decided. I posted a video of myself singing, a hobby I'd abandoned after a cruel critique from a peer years ago. My throat felt dry with anxiety as I pressed post, but to my surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Encouraged, I began taking small steps towards the life I had been too afraid to pursue. I took an improv class, started painting again, and even signed up for the local community theater auditions. Each action felt like peeling back layers that saturated me with a mixture of doubt and fear. Days turned into weeks, and my social media feed started to transform into a tapestry of my creative endeavors. But it didn't stop there. I felt drawn to Clara, her wisdom beckoning me back for more. I started attending her workshops regularly, where I met others looking to change their lives, all guided under her light. It was intoxicating. But then, that light began to dim. One evening, I arrived at a session only to find the cafe closed, an ominous release sign hanging on the door. Confused, I checked my phone for any updates but found nothing. It was as if Clara had vanished into thin air. Not one to give up so easily, I searched for her online. I dead-ended on forum after forum until finally, I discovered a thread discussing her in a negative light. Apparently, Clara had a history of things far worse than opportunistic motivations. There were whispers of manipulations, of people who had followed her advice blindly only to end up worse off than before. My heart raced. Had I been one of her targets? Had I really let my walls down, only to build them back up stronger than before? I sought out others from her sessions, hoping to find camaraderie, but they had mostly moved on, some dismissing my concerns as paranoia. I became obsessed, diving deeper into her past, uncovering stories of people who felt duped, betrayed. My newfound perspective seemed tainted, and I feared I had merely replaced the old trauma with a new one. What if every success I experienced was built on false foundations? What if Clara had a more sinister purpose beyond helping us? My nights grew restless, filled with visions of her. I began to notice the energies of those around me, the way they carried their burdens, the masks they wore. That spark of hope she initialized began to morph into a shadow that consumed me, leaving me to wonder if I had replaced one form of darkness with another. The night of the final straw arrived when I received a direct message from Clara. It was jarring, an invitation to meet at a secluded park, an old haunt of hers. In her elegant script, she promised clarity, urging me to trust her just one more time. Approaching the park that night, the fog hung low, shrouding everything in an eerie stillness. A sense of unease crept over me. I hesitated. My instincts screamed to turn back, but I was drawn to the possibility of resolution, of reclaiming the hope she'd initially sparked. Instead, I stumbled across something I never expected, a poorly concealed dark side, evidence of a life she had woven around suffering, almost as if she thrived on the emotional upheaval she spiraled us all into. As I stood there, hidden behind the twisted branches, clarity washed over me, and in that moment, I understood my journey wasn't about finding strength through her aid but carving my path amidst the debris. I walked home, leaving behind the allure of a false savior. I had encountered a life coach, yes, but more profoundly, I had encountered myself. I realized I didn't need anyone else to dictate my worth. I am the author of my narrative. And for the first time in years, I felt the weight lift. I was free.
I never thought a wedding could turn so dark, but I still see it all so vividly. The day I became a bride etched into my memory like a tainted photograph, colors bleeding into a haze that still haunts me. The venue was stunning, draped in fairy lights and blossoms, each table adorned with flickering candles and flicks of pastel elegance, but the real centerpiece was the wedding cake, a towering, decadent creation that I had painstakingly crafted to be vegan. I've been a vegan for years, and though friends told me I was crazy to not cater to the normies by incorporating dairy, I stood firm. I was proud of my cake. Everything about it was a testament to the care I took in my choices: organic ingredients, no animal products, nothing but love poured into every layer, and the sweetest part was the anticipation of seeing my guests' delighted faces as they took their first bite. The ceremony was flawless, vows whispered amid the gentle rustling of wind through the trees, eyes brimming with joy. Everyone had a great time until a close family member, Aunt Rita, arrived unusually late but with a swarm of negativity, which I'll pray stays confined to that one day. Nobody expected her to spoil the vibe. She was a vegetarian, so what could go wrong? How could she possibly know that I'd decided against labeling my cake as vegan? I mean, it's just a cake, the flavor ought to be enough to win hearts, right? True, I had debated that morning if I should put a little sign by the cake that read vegan, but ultimately felt it unnecessary, knowing my guests hardly cared for labels when paired with sugar. But then, Rita came over, her face pinched in disapproval like she'd bitten into a sour lemon while grumbling about tricking her into eating something she didn't know wasn't laden with eggs or cream, her eyes darting around the party like a hawk ready to pounce on her prey, an accusative glare aimed directly my way. I tried to explain, my voice trembling slightly with the gravity of the situation, that veganism wasn't a trick or a trap, it was a lifestyle choice, part of who I am, but it only took her a moment to dismiss my heartfelt reasoning. She was relentless, weaving herself into conversations, spreading her sentiment like a contagion. Other guests started to murmur, unsure, curious whispers swirling like dark clouds above a picnic. What if the cake was subpar? What if it wasn't just an ethical decision but a culinary catastrophe? I felt rage boiling in my stomach, a sickening mix of guilt and frustration. I had crafted every layer with love and had tasted it myself, wincing at the thought that something I created could be seen as less than worthy, a weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating. But as the evening wore on, I lost control and snapped, demanding that if Rita was so offended by my choices, she could feel free to leave. A big sigh rippled through my guests, and silence hung in the air like a noose, tense with disbelief, leaving me drowning in isolation. Isolation turned to paranoia as I grabbed my glass of champagne, clutching it like a lifeline, yet the bubbles fizzed dead against the chill creeping slowly through my heart, gnawing at my sanity. That night descended into chaos filled with uneaten slices of my beloved cake, a beautiful meal reduced to a spoil of war, with whispers darting around like knife blades. Everyone tiptoed around the situation, my closest friends trying to hold the party together while Aunt Rita cornered them like a predator, spreading her seeds of discontent and uncertainty. But when the midnight hour chimed, and the guests began to shuffle out, I was left with an emptiness so profound it was as if the universe was gaping wide, ready to swallow me whole. Did I really just ruin the happiest day of my life all for a single label? I wanted to scream, to claw at the walls, to demand they all see how I poured myself into every inch of that cake and how it reflected me, a reflection I now regretted, as if it was all but a shattered mirror. A few friends stayed behind to help me clean up amid the silence punctuated by clinking dishes and the weight of unspoken words. One asked, gentle but firm, Ida for not labeling it vegan? And I felt my heart drop like a stone, my emotions swirling. I tried to explain that it wasn't about the cake or fooling anyone, but about my identity, and by not labeling it, I believed I was inviting everyone into my world. But then the reality crashed. Was it all in vain? And now, with that bitter aftertaste seated deep within my chest, my mind spiraled with doubt, as the shadows in the corners leaned closer, whispering tales of regret and what could have been. The bridal dreams I once held meandered into nightmares, and as I stood alone among the remnants of what could have been a fairy tale, I pondered the true cost of trying to stay true to myself in a world of labels, where kindness was weaponized, and my love was seen as a trick. The cake stood sentinel on a table, untouched and betrayed, while echoes of laughter and joy faded into melancholy, leaving me trapped between joy and despair, lost in the darkness of my own creation.